All right, we are live. So, hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining me here today. I have with me someone who is very patient with me, even though I've been delayed the start for this stream a little bit. We have Gabriel Lucas, and I'm very happy he's joining me today because we're going to be discussing something we've talked a lot about in the past, that being sort of the nature of morality and the discussion on this subject framed sort of in the way that Peterson and Harrison framed it a little bit, but getting into our own thoughts on the issue as well. So thanks for joining me, man.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and so we've had a couple discussions about this on Twitter and both Discord and things like that in the past regarding what makes truth, whether it's subjectivity or objectivity and things like that. And from what I've seen, you do tend to take more so from Sam Harris's point of view. Is that inaccurate or about right?
Uh yeah, I'd say that's inaccurate. Um okay, so
Wait,
in terms
accurate
of
or inaccurate? I'm sorry.
yeah, no, not quite. I sympathize with the atheistic worldview and Sam Harris's worldview to a certain extent. Um but when you read into things a little bit more, you realize that the notion of truth is not quite as simple as many people would like to believe.
Hmm.
And so if we're looking at just that particular discussion, the Sam Harris Jordan Peterson one, I've made a couple of videos on that. I made one way back when it first came out, where I did like uh, a really superficial look at it to try to sort of get an understanding of where they're both coming from, because I could see where both were coming from, and I found that a lot of people were ruling out the other person's worldview as just nonsense, straight up. No one
Hmm.
was looking to actually understand or engage with the philosophy behind these different ideas of what truth means. A lot of people like to think that truth is a philosophically unproblematic term, which is very wrong.
Oh yeah,
Um,
definitely.
yeah, so I made a video about that. It would have been like a year ago now, and it wasn't great, but it was popular. But it wasn't great because it was very superficial. I did some more reading into some of the background that Jordan Peterson comes from, specifically the tradition of pragmatism, which is an American philosophy, a post-Darwinian philosophy that's very much more about the functional nature of ideas rather than this sort of absolute either scientific truth or transcendent higher truth. It's more about what works for us to survive, or what
Yeah.
allows us to make the world work for us. And so it fits nicely with a scientific worldview in a certain way, but it has certain constraints on it. But
Hmm.
after looking at that and thinking more about Peterson's view on religion, I made a second video about 4 months ago, I think, where I laid out what I think is a proper defense of Jordan Peterson's view on truth in the context of uh, religious
Hmm.
ideas.
I think
So
that's
I land more on Jordan Peterson's side, but I can see why people don't like that. So
Yeah, I see what you mean. And I'm not sure. I think that was the video I first reached out to talk to you about it. But I think one of the pitfalls of Peterson's view, because I've just started reading Maps of Meaning myself, and it's a very good book. And
mm,
immediately after reading just about like a quarter of the way through the book or so,
I
I
think I got
can
about that far as well. Yeah.
yeah, it's almost a textbook in itself. But it's very easy to see where he grabs this kind of view from, because it very much ties into his belief that truth needs to entail the value that we perceive of an action and
Mm,
sort of where that value comes from. And so I understand the idea that truth needs to be pragmatic, of course, but I do feel as that sometimes just leaving it to a sort of pragmatic sense leads to a sort of egoism almost, in the sense that what works broadly doesn't work necessarily on the individual level. Like broadly, what we would say is that murder is wrong because it has all these negative societal effects. But if you come down to an individual level and there's somebody who can get away with murder and there's somebody who can not necessarily feel the consequences and it's not going to have massive societal ramifications, that person may say, well, it's not harming society. it's not and it's pragmatic for me personally to get to commit this act, despite what larger society might say. And so I might as well commit it because it'll best help me in some way, shape, or form. And so I think when you allow sort of let me do what's best for me kind of thinking to sort of creep in. I know that's not exactly what Peterson advocates, but I think that's somewhat of a logical continuation you can make at that point.
That's yeah. So I think you've slipped a moral discussion into a discussion about truth, and I can see why you did that. But my understanding of Jordan Peterson's pragmatic view of truth is that the truths that we understand about the world serve a function, and we have to sort of establish what that function is prior to actually investigating the world. And that's why he says that scientific truth, in his words, is nested inside a moral truth. And one of the ways this actually makes sense in the philosophy of science is trying to work out where values play a role. Right. A lot of people like to think that there's no role for value in science, but in most of the cases, that's probably true. I don't think value should play a role in what we determine to be scientifically correct. But it does play a role in determining what kinds of questions we ask and what kind of questions we think are important, what kind of problems we think are worth solving. And that determines our starting point, right?
Right.
And that's where the normative aspect of science comes in. So the idea of the pragmatic idea of truth tying into moral systems is that the morality sort of comes as a prerequisite rather than a consequence. That's how I understand it. So I don't know if there's I don't think that you can see a pragmatic idea of morality embedded into this. It's not about expediency, which I think is what you're getting at, right? It's I think you've sort of flipped it on its head, and that's not the impression that I get from what someone like Jordan Peterson talks about. I mean, he talks about the psychological truth embedded in religion and how that can act as a moral guidance that then we bring into our understanding of truth in the universe, right? So yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think I get what you're saying. I suppose what I would say about that is when making it seems what Jordan Peterson tries to do in Maps of Morality is that he seems to try to uh, tie. He makes a lot of claims to a priori knowledge that there are things that, like you said, we make our prerequisites, and that determines much more. Like he makes reference to in one of the earlier parts of the book that a lot of times when you had alchemists back in the day, that what they were doing wasn't necessary, and the truths, quote unquote, that they were sort of producing for their time weren't necessarily truths as the way we would think of them, but culturally relevant truths and things like that. And so I think when we try to take the discussion like that and sort of make morality the prerequisite, it makes it a little bit odd because you still need to understand, like, morality can't just be, I don't think, post hoc feelings. Like I disagree with with the notions that some Ryan Falk, aka the alternative hypothesis, says this in a couple of his videos, that morality is just feelings that we're trying to justify. And so I
Well,
don't like.
if just really quickly, if you want to bring that to someone more well known, that's basically Jonathan Haidt's view.
Yeah,
And
right.
David Hume's view, for that matter.
Yeah, and so that's sort of why I kind of flip it on its head as I do, because I don't quite believe that. I mean, truth is necessary for moral. I think truth is a necessary prerequisite for morality, and so I don't think you can have a morality without basing it on some truths. Like I think even if you were to say that morality is post hoc based on certain feelings within groups or tribes and what benefits them the most, there is at least on some level some actual truth to that, something grounded within reality. And so I think it's important to try to root that out first before we build the construct of morality, and then from there get into what is pragmatic. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. Okay. So I have a theory about how this can be resolved or dissolved to a certain degree. So if we just assume for the sake of argument that morality or moral feelings or moral sentiments are exactly that, the feelings and sentiments, they're subjective intuitions from individuals, right?
Mhm.
And they're intuitions about what is good, about what we want, what we value, and to a certain extent, the way in which or the means by which we achieve what we want and what we value are sort of a separate question. So there are things that we want, and that's a subjective desire, shall we say,
Mhm.
whether that's for survival or for companionship or for community with others, perhaps, all kinds of different things. And we can tie that into moral foundations theory to a certain extent as well to make it more specific. But the point is, these are what we want, right?
Mhm.
Um, now, we can take the fact value distinction to, but we can only take that so far. I know that you're skeptical of that, but
Right. And this is like kind of addressing the is ought gap.
yeah, exactly. So there are certain things that we know about the world, more or less, right?
Mhm.
But they cannot tell us what we ought to do, right?
Yes.
But in determining how we get what we want, those facts about the world place certain pragmatic constraints on what we can actually do to achieve that, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And so, in that sense, what you were saying about the truth to morality within what helps us survive or what helps a tribe thrive to a certain extent, that comes down. The way I look at it is the truth is embedded in the pragmatic constraints on what we can do to achieve what we want, right? So and that's where the pragmatism comes in. But ultimately, you're still looking at a moral impulse, shall we say, as a kind of prerequisite for determining what is true in the if we define true as what works or what's functional. um so I think that framework still works in that context,
Okay.
and there's a certain constraint on the is ought gap. Like there are ways that you can not necessarily bridge it, but you can narrow the gap to a certain extent, because
Mhm.
yes, you can't derive an ought from an is, but only certain oughts will get you what you want, right? So
Yes.
you can't be truly postmodern about it. You have to operate within the constraints of reality.
Yeah, and so I see what you're saying there, and I agree that the truth is nestled within the pragmatic reality of what you can do to achieve the ought that you desire. However, I am a bit skeptical of the uh, definition of the truth that you put forward, which is that it will always conform to the pragmatic reality. In that, again, I think there are certainly pragmatic things you can do to achieve the ought you desire, but that doesn't that just because it's pragmatic for you to do at the moment, I don't think that governs whether you should do it or not, whether you ought to do it. And so I think, and I think this kind of goes back to this is where I think I find you borrowing a little bit more from the Sam Harris definition of the truth, whereas wherein truth is that which conform that just that which conforms to reality. And I think that's a little bit more Harris's definition, and Jordan Peterson tries to take it a little bit more so to the domain of. I think he's a little bit more moral foundations theory than Sam Harris, because when I heard Sam Harris talk about the truth, he was just truth is strict accordance with reality and sort of no regard for the is ought gap whatsoever. Whereas,
Well,
sorry, go ahead.
no, finish your point.
Whereas I think Peterson makes an attempt, albeit a bad one, at trying to make the claim that there are moral and psychological truths that should be absolute and considered objective beyond just what is feeling and things like that. Because, like I said before, the truth of what is pragmatic or the truth of what feelings you happen to have on a matter isn't exactly, well, I think there's actually new territory, but how you feel on the matter or what might be right at that moment isn't necessarily a binding truth. It's not necessarily a universal. It's just what works for you or your tribe at that particular moment. It's not necessarily something where if you try to share this with another tribe or another individual, it might, if you say, well, this is just how we do it and this is how it works for me or my tribe, it's not necessarily binding. And if it's not universal, is it really a truth, so to speak?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is where we get into the problematic territory of defining what is true, right?
Mm,
Um, Curiously enough, I think that Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson's conceptions of truth are broadly compatible in the sense of, Sam Harris has a more correspondence theory of truth. Uh, he's more in line with the scientific realists, which would be the belief that the scientific theories provide a true understanding of the world. And I think on some stronger variants that scientific facts are all there is to know about the world. Um,
mm,
so I, I think Jordan Peterson accepts the scientific worldview and the scientific framework, but expands the notion of truth to encapsulate something else as well as that, right?
yeah.
Um, and you said that that doesn't work because it's leaning too much on the pragmatic considerations,
Mm.
because for you, you consider truth to be something more transcendent.
Yeah, I'd say it's something along the lines of I'm only just getting into what I guess people would call the ancients, like Plato and Aristotle and
Hmm.
things like that. But I guess it would, very broadly speaking, it would be what you'd call, say, the form of truth. And that form
Yeah,
is
right.
something more than just what corresponds with our reality. What we have here in our physical world as we know it is kind of a shadow or a cheap knockoff,
Yep.
almost, if
Yep.
you would,
Okay.
of the form of truth.
Yeah, I'm only superficially familiar with Plato's theory of forms, but I think I get the idea. But my question to you would be, to what extent do we actually have the right to speak of higher truths that we can't directly access?
Well, that's a very good question. And I think the answer is something like we have a reasonable degree to speak of it just because we can't access, say, the pure form of truth itself, because we're still living in a world governed by truth. And this is why I very much rail against Sam Harris's worldview of the truth,
Sorry,
because
can you repeat that? You said we still live in a world ruled by truth.
okay, yeah. We still live in a world governed by what is the form of truth, because truth is all encompassing, and that's why I sort of rail against Sam Harris's worldview of truth simply being accordance with the physical world, because what the physical sciences and what Sam Harris does and what other scientists do is they discover particular dots of truth, you might say, in what is the larger points of truth, on what the larger plane of truth might be. Whereas the philosophical reality is that truth is a set of laws and rules that we can kind of get a grasp of. Like we can use not only deductive reasoning, but we can use obviously experiential knowledge. There's a
Okay.
lot of ways of getting at the truth, even if we don't necessarily have access to it in its
So
full proper form.
so by laws and rules, do you mean scientific laws and rules, like physics?
Um, Certainly, like physical laws, like
Yep.
those in the sciences, but also logical laws, I think, as well. I
Hmm.
know there's a bit of a discussion about it, logic isn't exactly objective. Obviously, you can take different axiomatic starting points. Like I know some people choose to abandon the law of non-contradiction and things of that, which is somewhat
Yeah.
radical, but that's just
There,
the example
there's
that comes to mind.
there's also a debate about whether things like logic and mathematics really exist. So realism about
Mm,
these things, or anti-realism or conventionalism, whether they're made up constructs to approximate uh, the world. And that's a little bit outside my field, but I've dabbled in a little bit of it. It's very technical, very complicated stuff. So it's not an
mm.
easy question to answer.
Yeah,
But
like uncertainty principle and things like that.
a lot of things like that. I'm just flagging that so that if people want to look at that in their own time, there's a lot of interesting stuff there.
Definitely, definitely. And I think that's sort of, I think all of these things are sort of valuable in the larger discussion on truth itself. Like, I think there are certainly things like I think we can kind of, to some extent, get at truth through all these different laws, even if some people choose radically different axiomatic starting points, because I think, I think something like the law of non-contradiction is something that we can clearly see corresponds with reality well enough to be accepted as a universal. There's some quote from an Islamic scholar along the lines of the person who does not hold the law of non-contradiction should be beaten and flogged until he agrees that being beaten is not the same as not being beaten, and being flogged is not the same as not being flogged. So, I think that's a pragmatic example or a realistic example of how certain logical principles can be applied. And I think if we can sort of piece together those logical principles that are self-evident, so somewhat, maybe not a priori, but at least axiomatic, I think we can begin to get at the larger framework of truth itself. And that's why I think we can speak to it with some degree of certainty, even though we may not have access to the whole of it.
Yeah. So I see what you're saying. I look at it more sort of in the other direction. So the pragmatist philosophy is kind of comes with an acceptance of human limitation. So there might be some transcendent truth, right? There might be some higher truth, some platonic, pure truth that's objective and universal. But how can we speak of it, or more directly, how can we make sense of it pragmatically? In what way does it actually make any difference to us, one way or the other? And if we can't access it directly, and if we can't tell what kind of difference it actually makes, there's a real question about whether it actually makes sense to talk about it, or whether we actually have the right to talk about it, whether we should talk about it. And I think that the pragmatic worldview is to bring things down a scale and say, well, let's not bother ourselves with the higher truths that don't actually make any difference to us. Let's look at what does make a difference to us. Let's look at what actually has practical consequences for us. And if it has practical consequences for us, then it's worth talking about and worth investigating. But if it doesn't, well, we can't reach it anyway, so there's no point to talk about it. And it doesn't make any difference to us, so there's no reason to talk about it. Right? It doesn't actually add anything to our understanding of our experience. And so it's more about just bring things back to I guess our immediate sphere, what we actually know we can talk about, right? And so I see it as more of a bottom up philosophy of start from the ground level of what we know and what we experience, and work our way up as far as we can until we get to the point where, okay, there's not really much we can say about this. It doesn't really make much of a difference. It's a bit too abstract and speculative. And just draw the line there and say, right, we don't need to go above that.
Well, see, I certainly understand what you're getting at, and I think that there's certainly some of philosophy that is far too high-minded and doesn't necessarily have real applications. Although I'd like to think that the majority of philosophy has had a good amount of practical application, whether we're talking about something like the trolley problem as like one of the more famous examples, or questions about justice and things like that. So I do think most of philosophy would have those practical applications. I think the slight trouble with what you're talking about is it takes a little bit of the hard line skeptic, and I mean skeptic in the proper philosophical sense here, not YouTube skeptic, but
not TM skeptic.
Yes, not TM skeptic, but I think it sort of takes that approach to sort of the ridiculous, this extreme of if you're walking towards a cliff, is that cliff really there? Does it have, or is it just in my mind kind of thing?
Well, I mean, the obvious pragmatic answer to that is, well, am I going to die if I fall down it? And the answer is probably yes. So don't fall down it, right? You can be, this sort of idealistic, well, it's just an idea in my mind, so it might not actually be real, but
yeah.
How far do we want to go down that road? How far does how is that actually useful for us? What's useful is determining, right, how far can we operate within the constraints of reality in a way that's conducive to our I don't want to use loaded moral terms like flourishing or well-being, but you sort of get my picture, that allows us to function in a way that works for us, broadly speaking.
Yeah, and I think there's certainly something to that. What I would say though is that the question is, of course, when do you draw the line at that point, and who decides where the line is drawn? Because what might be a high-minded philosophical concept to one is the basis for all morality in someone else's view, and so what becomes important in itself becomes a value judgment, which requires some philosophizing in its own right. Because I have all these quotes that I have no idea who they're from, but I'm just letting everybody know that I didn't come up with this. I forget who said it, but somebody once said that we all practice philosophy on some basic level, and like whether you value human flourishing or suffering to some degree, at some level you have to justify why you like those things. And so if you were to talk to somebody who's of a more radical belief, like anarcho-primitivists, and they just think that what would objectively be qualified as the human flourishing of the last 2 centuries or so, like during the Industrial Revolution, has been absolutely horrible. And like the construction of agriculture and cities and all this thing has been absolutely horrible, because we're no longer like tribes in small numbers, and we're facing all this disease and stuff, even though our lives have been objectively improving in a lot of quantitative ways. But they'd still want that torn down because of their value judgments that humanity was better in this other way. And so no matter where you decide to draw the line, it still requires some level of basic philosophizing that will usually end up with what will usually bring you sort of back to what one might consider a high-minded concept. And so while it's good to try and draw the line so you don't get lost in useless philosophizing, that line is almost impossible to determine, I would say. And so I think that getting a whole scope on the issue, even if it's a rough one, is important to some extent.
Well, that's interesting, because this almost brings us directly to the intuitionist theory of moral psychology. Because what you're talking about when it comes to high-minded concepts that we consider to be the basis for our morality, people like Jonathan Haidt, I think, have established fairly well that that's more of a deeply rooted intuition of our minds, right? And I assume you're familiar a little bit with Haidt's work, but for those who aren't,
Yeah, yeah.
What really drove this point home for me was the dumbfounding effect, which he documented and researched as being the effect when you challenge someone's moral preconceptions with rationalizations, and you shift the context around so that it makes more moral sense. The obvious example that he gives is incest, right? So people feel that incest is wrong, and then you ask them why, and they'll come up with a rationalization like, well, it leads to birth defects. And you say, okay, so let's say that there's 100% no chance of having a child. The contraception is perfect, or perhaps they're sterile, whatever. And they will say, well, no, I still feel it's wrong pretty much all the time. And they'll come up with another reason why that is. And so the point being that what we think are rational moral considerations are actually more deeply rooted emotional intuitions that form the basis of our moral reasoning. And most of our moral reasoning is, as a result, post hoc rationalizations of these underlying feelings. And so I see what you're saying, in the sense of you kind of need some kind of fundamental basis or foundation for your moral ideas. Perhaps where we differ is the ultimate source of those
Mm.
ideas. You might consider that to be a more transcendent truth, or something reached by a Platonic idea of reason, or something like that. I would more lean towards the idea that these are irrational, emotional intuitions. Simply, and I think that the dumbfounding effect provides good evidence for that, in the sense of what we think is rational is actually not, because we don't have a rational reason for them. We strip away all the rational justifications. We don't change our mind. We still cling to our impulses, so to speak.
Well, I think one of the points on which I would sort of, because I've seen Haidt's work, and at one of the points I think I would kind of diverge from what is the normal consensus on what Haidt finds, is that I think there are obviously these moral sentiments which we all hold, which are ingrained in us, be it because of our actual neurology and how we're wired, or because of the culture we're raised, or how we're just raised in our parents and things like that. But I wouldn't necessarily say this is the root of what makes something moral or where it comes from. Rather, it's more of a determining factor in what morality we will end up holding. Like, I'm sure if you were to measure which of the moral, how many moral foundations did I mention? Six or so?
Yeah, you mentioned six.
Yeah, of the six, I'm sure like the moral foundations to different groups, such as different religions, like between Islam and Judaism and Catholic Christianity and Protestant Christianity, each of those groups would vary differently in the foundations that it chooses to value more than others. And while those might be, say, determined by genetics and such, that doesn't actually determine the objectivity or the truth of that moral system. It's just entailing which one you as an individual are more so likely to believe. Because, I mean,
Mhm.
this goes back to kind of to the discussion again on where does truth actually come from? Is it something transcendent? Is it something that we just try to justify post hoc as beings? And I think if you try to say, to be sort of pragmatic about it, is that to just say that morality is a human concept sort of loses morality's authority. Because if you say that morality is just of humans and what we construct, then there's nothing really binding you to it, because you can just say, well, as a man, I choose not to obey this morality because my construct of morality is just as valid as any other man's. When you become a moral subjectivist or relativist to some extent, you lose the ability to make normative claims, because you make morality something just of us and not higher and transcendent than us. Whereas if you make it transcendent and you say, no, this is above us and this is why it ought to be obeyed because it governs us in a more complete way, then you give morality some credence and people are more likely to follow it that way. So that's just sort of a
I,
consequentialist, I guess, pragmatic take on it. So
okay, so I see what you're saying, and I get the concern absolutely. I'm not sure whether you're making the wishful thinking argument of, well, if morality is subjective, then there's no authority, so therefore anyone can do what they want, and that's not good for society, which I think is a fairly weak argument, or whether you're making a claim as to the definition of morality, and or like this essential component of morality is its objectivity and its authority. And if what we call morality doesn't have that characteristic, then we can't call it morality. So I think you're making one of the two claims, but it's
I think
I'm
it's
not
a little. I think it's a little of column A, a little of column B, actually. In
okay.
that, one, I do think morality has to be objective, and I think it needs that quality to it. Otherwise, if it doesn't
Otherwise, you
have like
can't
the
call it
latter, it
morality.
doesn't have the
Yeah.
former. Like if it isn't objective, then it loses authority, and people just won't obey it. So it's kind of like one leads to the other, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting because so you have this conception of morality as being um, an authority to which we conform, rather
Hmm.
than a sense of value that guides our actions, right? So you
Yes,
have a more
exactly.
top-down view of morality. I would have a more bottom-up view of morality.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good description, and I
Mm.
think that's largely just as someone who believes in God, I think that's very much accurate, because uh, the way I choose to answer the question of the Euthyphro question, as it were, like, is something good just because God says it is good, or is it good and then God just happens to go along with it? I think that sort of sets up a false dichotomy where instead of just saying something is good because God says so, or it's good before it assumes that there is good outside of God. And so what I would say is that God is the form of good. He is the form of truth. He is that authority which we appeal to. He is morality itself, which is why I think there's that authority to it, and that's why I think it's such a necessary characteristic for things like morality and truth.
Okay, that's interesting because I was going to ask you, um, okay, so if morality is top-down, then where is the top authority that it comes from? And then you mentioned God, and I said, okay, what? So that's there's a bit of uh, not a bedrock, but a disconnect here, because as someone who doesn't believe in God, that framework just doesn't work for me,
Mm,
right? So
sure.
I don't want to get into a debate about the metaphysics of God, because
Right.
that's
It's a bit beyond the
centuries
scope for
long.
this
So
conversation. Yeah.
yeah, but it's relevant, and I think people can see why that's relevant in this context. So we can sort of flag that and put that to
Yeah.
the
Well,
side.
you could kind of take an atheistic Aristotelian approach to it, which is what my friend Dustbringer does. He's an Aristotelian objectivist, and he has sort of a it's one of the reasons objectivism has appealed to me, because it makes the same claim I do, essentially, that morality is an authority to be appealed to that comes from the top down, but they do so without the existence of God. It's not something I'm convinced of, but it's certainly if you explore the deeper aspects of
Yeah.
objectivism, that's there. So you could take objectivism as an example of something that appeals to morality itself as a higher power, or not necessarily a higher power, but an objective, transcendent truth without there being a God.
Well, we could take a perhaps more esoteric look at religion, and borrow that from someone like Jordan Peterson, because I think I don't know if you saw my video on this, but I've been saying this for a while. I think his view of religion is more atheistic than he would like to admit,
Yeah,
because
no,
because
I
I
think I
don't think
remember
he
that.
believes in like um a a literal God as an actual existent authority figure. He won't admit that because he kind of wants to cling to his metaphysical framework. I think he should just accept the scientific framework and go with the Darwinian version. But he rationalizes it. He rationalizes it as he described it in one sense as what we call God is our highest ideal. It's our highest principle, right? And
Mm,
so in that sense, it's sort of in a weird way, it unifies the top down and bottom up approaches by saying what we imagine to be a top down highest ideal actually arises from our bottom up uh, moral intuitions to a certain extent, right? Now,
mm,
uh, as another layer on top of that, our culture and upbringing play a very strong role in that, which is why I would consider myself to be something of a cultural conservative, to say that we should have imparted on us as children the morals and values and uh, cultural conventions of those that came before us, because
yeah.
that's how you allow for a continuity of a civilization and a society, right?
I think this
So
is very much where Peterson sort of borrows. I think this is the very clear borrowings of Nietzsche in his work come from, because it's very much sort of
right.
alluding to, if vaguely, to the whole master slave morality idea, and that the idea that this morality should be imparted to upon us by those who have sort of become the Ubermensch in some sense, and those who are actually striving towards that transcendent good which they set for themselves.
Okay, I think
Did I kind of mess that up a little bit?
no, I don't think so. Maybe in a very broad sense, Nietzsche's master slave morality was much more specific.
Yeah, fair
Um,
enough.
like it's not just the morality of the master and slave. Um, like that's okay. Hold on.
It's a very shallow
Um,
interpretation. Yeah, I was
yeah, that
intentionally doing that.
that's more Hegelian than Nietzschean from my understanding. But um, yeah, his master and slave morality were very specific ideals that he outlined in, I think it was chapter 5 or 6 of Beyond Good and Evil, and probably elsewhere as well. I haven't read as much Nietzsche as I should have, but um, the but you're right in some sense that it's more, like a lot to do with your position in society and the way you could sort of loosely describe that as a master slave morality dichotomy. Um, I think it's more of an evolutionary point, though, in the sense of, yeah, I think there's some truth to what you're saying. So, what we imagine to be higher moral truths are actually the consequence of certain kinds of people who manage to rise to the top of a society
Mm,
and shape it according to their particular ideas, and bring people up into that particular environment. Now, that itself is a very long process, a very long and gradual process. It's not like a Platonic philosopher king just stood up and said, right, this is Western culture. No, it's more emergent than that, right? And I think,
Right. Yeah.
and that's Jordan Peterson's view. He ties that to religious ideas by saying that we've developed this idea of a transcendent truth from Christ and his story and the ideas that came before that then were injected into the Christ myth,
Mm.
and then the traditions that flowed on from that. I think, yeah. So one of the things I really like about his work is that it kind of synthesizes, in my opinion, these two ideas within a pragmatic framework, right? So it's kind of, it's not quite deflationist in the sense of removing truth entirely, but it's reworking these linguistic conventions to make more sense within different contexts, right? So something like the
Yeah.
idea of God. Well, is God a transcendent being? Not really. It's more of an idea of a transcendent being or a transcendent ideal that we've invented and have embedded into our subconscious over many thousands of years over time. And that regulates our behavior in that sense, right? So it kind of functions like a higher ideal, like a top down morality, even though that's not the ultimate source.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that I remember him describing it as such in multiple occasions, and I think that is a fairly good way of describing it. I think, of course, the one thing I get at again is that having it be such that if you're admitting that it's only a construct of evolution or of what we perceive to be the best, then you allow it to sort of be infiltrated by people who say, well, now I believe it to be something else, or we've moved past this certain transcendent ideal because of X, Y, and Z. And so, again, I think it lacks the authority that would make something necessary to be a properly like binding moral system, because transcendent ideals are often hard to impose upon ourselves, but easy to sort of say that others should live up to, or even just in general, it's hard to apply that to a whole society. And so, I think that's sort of where Peterson's definition falls off.
Okay. I see that as just being a fact, a tragic fact of humanity,
Hmm.
in the sense that what we consider to be moral ideas are just ideas, right? And become, they sort of have this allure of a transcendent authority by basis of being so deeply rooted in our psyche and our collective psyche, right? Because it's sort of, you need to have that feedback from other people. You need to have a culture that enforces this. It can't just be individualized, right?
Mhm.
But the point is, it can be individualized, and that's where you get some sort of nihilistic tendencies and fragmentations of societies. And you can, like you said, have someone come up with a new idea that destroys the old idea and the old system. And that's absolutely correct. And um, the question is, what are we going to do about that? Because I don't think appealing to this transcendent idea is going to help us there. I think we need to actually operate within this understanding of where our morality comes from. I know it's sort of a weak argument on the subjectivist side, but I do still see the value in it. The idea that because people can come up with new ideas, that there's no objectivity to it. But I guess the point is, if you have your own idea of morality, well, let's say you're the only one who has that idea. You're the only Catholic in the world, right? In a world that's full of hedonistic utilitarians, right?
Right, right.
Where's your morality there? Where's your transcendence there? Everyone else around you acts as though they have a completely different idea of morality to you. Where's the authority in that? You can appeal to some kind of transcendent authority. You can appeal to the existence of God, but it's not going to help you in the real world.
Yeah,
So
I see the point you're making, and it's a valuable one for sure, because it's one that we all kind of have to acknowledge at a point. If And I think that's sort of where the applied versus theoretical side of philosophy sort of comes in, because if you're the only one living out your morality, then that sort of makes it very shallow, and there is no real earthly authority that you have per se where you can say, well, oh, this is best and such. And I think that's certainly a problem. What I would say, though, is that it's sort of an idea of just because you don't have just because you're enacting out something by yourself and everybody else is off doing their own thing doesn't necessarily make you wrong. Like I think the saying is like, can 10 million Frenchmen really be wrong? And I think there's a very interesting book by a Jesuit named Father Martin something, or James Martin or something. But it goes into the idea that, well, yes, everybody else can be wrong, and everybody else has been wrong at certain points in history where popular opinion was completely wrong on certain points. And so I think the idea is really how it does sort of come back to like Haidt's moral foundation theory of like the dumbfounding effect, where you know, given the fact that it would be rational to just go along with everything else, you stick to your own morality. But I don't think that's necessarily just because you're unwilling to change. But I think to even play into the point of Peterson, you find some greater truth in it. And I think I do think what Peterson says is necessary, because I think finding transcendence is good. And I think a society like the society you talk about, a hedonistic utilitarian kind of one that lacks any transcendence whatsoever, is one that's really going to sort of fall into what I would call Stirnerite egoism, in a sense. In that, are you familiar with Max Stirner at all?
Yeah, I'm familiar with a bit of Max Stirner, and I've known a number of egoists on the internet since I signed up for that.
Yeah, that seems to be where they all live. Like you'll find the radical right
I'm
and the radical left
very
out in
familiar
public,
with the
but
very crude sketch of Max Stirner that you see all over the place.
yeah, well, I mean, the funny thing is, none of them will deny that crude sketch whatsoever, because that's really all it is. It's sort of this idea that, you know, you can go on claiming that there's no positive proof, quote unquote, for any moral system, and therefore might is right is the correct moral system, and that therefore, you know, in the for lack of what they would define as proof, they can just assert that this other thing and the primacy of the individual is truth. But I think that's what hedonistic utilitarianism would kind of fall into. And I guess this kind of gets back to my consequentialist argument. If you don't have anything transcendent that you're striving to, and you're just doing what's best for you in the moment, that's really not morality per se, as much as it is just barbarism. That's not
I
determining truth. That's not determining morality. That's just being, so to speak.
Right. And I agree with you to some extent. I think that the idea of a transcendent morality and of, potentially a god as being that transcendent authority is a useful one for societies, right? And in that sense of being useful, it's kind of true in a pragmatic sense, right? So we can almost
We can like half agree on that kind of,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, exactly. I am not at all convinced by metaphysical arguments for the existence of God, and that's why I consider myself an atheist. I'm not an anti-theist because I can see the value in these kinds of ways of
Mm.
thinking and the way what they bring to a society and how they help a society function. So I have like a bit of a nuanced perspective on religion in that sense. So yeah, I can see that, and it's useful, and that's why I think again a respect for culture and to a certain extent tradition, although there's some caveats to that as well, is important as well. So this idea of there's no God, therefore anything goes, I don't quite buy, because we still have to organize society in a way that works, and we should take cues from the past in terms of looking at what's worked in the past and operate within those constraints and shape things gradually. So more of an
Mm.
evolutionary incrementalist view on
Yeah.
that
We'll
for
see
me.
what you're.
So
Sorry, go ahead.
yeah. So like even though I'm not religious in that sense, the ideas that it brings to the table are useful. I did want to say one thing though. You were saying that being one person who holds a moral view is, if you're the only one who holds a moral view, that doesn't make you wrong. And that's true. I wouldn't make the claim that that makes you wrong. But obviously it doesn't make you right. I
Of
think that
course, yeah.
framing it in that question, or framing the question in that way, is sort of bringing the notion of truth back into this, which is, I think, a little bit unhelpful, because morality, I think, is fundamentally a functional thing, right? So it's what helps us function in the world as an individual, in a society, and as a society as a whole. So, you know, if your idea isn't really helping you do that, there's a real question as to whether moral truth even applies in that context. But I don't know. I think that's a slightly broader question, perhaps.
No, it's certainly one worth asking, I believe, and it's certainly one I think everybody has to consider at some point. But to get back to what you said just a little bit before, when you were talking about what works best for a society and moving forward in that sort of broad sense, I think it kind of gets into that what I mentioned a little bit earlier, where on some level you're still doing a little bit of moralizing and making those normative claims that, oh, well, what I want to do with society and by bringing forth this flourishing is good, and therefore it should happen. So you're still
Mhm.
making sort of this appeal to the good in what you want, but if you don't have that universal value to people, then they really don't have necessarily that reason to listen. And but to get back to even your second point, where I'm sorry, could you just make it one more time?
Oh, okay. What are you referring to?
Uh, the point after okay, I got it. Like the pragmatic application of like philosophy. Like if it's not helping you function in a society, I think I think philosophy as a whole isn't. Well, obviously, it's meant to help a society function. I almost think that's somewhat of a secondary consequence of good philosophy that it makes society function. In some sense, I sort of borrow a little bit from Aristotelian virtue ethics in the idea that the purpose of philosophy and ethics in particular is less so to have everybody around you live a good life and function properly, but to get your own self in order so that you live a virtuous and a good life yourself. And if you do that, and if you set sort of an example, other people will follow because you, in your own way, become the transcendent ideal that other people reach up to in that sense. And so, while obviously, if you're doing good things for yourself and people want to follow you, that's going to bring society as a whole up. It also kind of ties into, oddly enough, it sort of ties into what small, little known sociologist by the name of Hans Hermann Hoppe talks about, because he a lot of
I've
times,
heard his name float around a little bit.
yeah, he's
Yeah.
very he's popular in sort of far right circles in that he talks about the civilization process, and what he describes as the civilization process is very much what kind of I just described, whereas good behaviors become ideal, and what Jordan Peterson talks about too is where good behaviors become idealized and people strive to them because they're successful in the real world, and then society falls in line and it progresses because that's good. And I think that's one of the reasons you actually saw Catholicism and Christianity uh, take off in large part, because you saw them living good lives, and people saw it, said, hey, these people, hey, they know what they're doing.
Oh
And
yeah,
so
that's
it spread. I think that's one of the big reasons that even with the rampant persecution of Christians that occurred in the early Roman Empire, they still managed to become what is essentially a dominant religious force today.
oh yeah, that I would agree with that. So that runs parallel to Jordan Peterson's view of the evolution of religious ideas in the sense of uh someone acted in a good way, or he would describe it as a heroic way because he's read too much
Mhm.
Jung. Um, but and then of course we want to emulate that person, and in wanting to emulate that, we tell stories about that person, and then those stories become this mythological uh, archetype as it's been abstracted from the particular examples and becomes a universal example, and then that becomes embedded in our culture um, as a kind of virtue ethics. So yeah, that I think that makes a lot of sense. It's
Hmm.
still an evolutionary account, and it's still, I think, fundamentally a naturalistic account of these things. So there's still an open question as to the role of the transcendent and the room for the
Hmm.
transcendent in this. But then it comes to how we define the transcendent, and then that's another open question. So
Yeah, I think I think broadly it sort of relies on the idea of, well, if you see this if you see this person doing well for themselves and you choose to reject it, obviously you do so at your own peril. But I think you have less people doing that when you make the case. that it is transcendent, but also I think it just allows morality to be more cohesive. If you say it is objective, and that you're not going to get away from the idea that everybody can you're not going to fall into the idea to say that, oh, everybody can do their own thing. It makes things far more cohesive and more coherent, at least, I would say.
Yeah. So, and well, this is something I said in my original morality video, which is, I think, when we first started chatting.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. So I said that at the end, where I added the clarification that an idea of an objective morality may be a very useful one for society. I don't think that means that there is an objective morality necessarily. But, you know, and with my point about a potential, I think how morality functions at present is in more of an intersubjective way, in this kind of mutual agreement between individuals mediated by a culture that forms the society. I think that functions in the and this is similar to the evolutionary and psychological account that you see from someone like Jordan Peterson. It functions like an objective morality, and I think it might be the best that we can get to an objective morality.
I think that's the best probably we could get people to agree on at the moment. I wouldn't say it's the best we can get. I think there's still room in the human psyche, so to speak, that there is an objective morality and that there is some transcendent form, because at some level I don't think people like fooling themselves. It's kind of like convincing people to believe in God based on something like Pascal's wager, where if you're just telling them to believe in God because they're hedging their bets and eventually they fool themselves into believing, they still know that. And so in that way, it doesn't really become binding. But I think if we sort of make the case more, which we can't do here, but perhaps another time, I think we can get into the cases for objective morality, and possibly at some point, if we want to use like the Thomistic approach, which borrows from the Aristotelian approach, we could make the case that it's a God that happens to be governing that objective morality. Because I think one of the reasons objectivism hasn't really gotten to me is because I don't really see much of a case for there being an objective morality outside of God. I find that a very tenuous stance to hold, which is why I'm still Catholic, of course. But I think that is very much another conversation altogether.
Well, I would agree with that to a certain extent. I think that if there was a God, there's probably a pretty strong case for an objective morality. Although we could pull some linguistic trickery and say, well, God is still a subject and it's still his subjective intuitions that are ruling the objective universe. So is that really objective? But that's a dumb question.
Yeah.
But yeah, no. So I would say that, like, if there was a God, that would be the case. I can see that potentially there could be like some semblance of a objective morality without God. I think that's very philosophically problematic, though.
Yeah.
But I also, this is one of my fundamental sticking points. I don't think an objective theory of morality is required for a moral system to function. And so I think the search is kind of missing the point of what it means to have a moral system. And that's why I brought the intersubjective aspect into it, because I think I would say that that's really all you need. And that can be mediated by religion and a theory of objective morality that gets people to believe in that, even though it's not necessarily the case. But it also comes with its own set of problems, in the sense of, well, once we accept that morality is nothing but the perspectives of individual people, then it leaves it open to be manipulated by those who are more malicious. But I think we can see that's happened all throughout history. That's just
definitely.
a human universal. It's part of it's one of the tragic aspects of the human condition, is that
we're morally corruptible. I think is to put it in more religious terms, that we're morally fallible beings, and we seek to perfect each other, but we'll never quite reach there. And there are varying degrees of perfection, obviously, amongst the human population in terms of morality and what we believe.
Exactly. And I think in order to address that, or to mitigate the harm caused by that fact, um, we need to have some pragmatic understanding of morality, some kind of, not necessarily consequentialist, because that's more about the content of morality. It's not less of a meta-ethical position. But the point is, we need to have maybe a naturalistic would be a better way of putting it, understanding of where morals come from, so that we can try to address that problem of human fallibility and moral corruptibility in a way that works, in a way that
Mhm.
works within the constraints of reality. I, like I said before, I think that if you're in that situation, and there are many throughout history where a morally corrupt being is taking real world power and trying to shape society in his image, um, an appeal to an objective principle, it just isn't going to help you, on a pragmatic level. It might help your moral uh, fortitude in yourself, but it's not going to have any real world effect unless you can get enough people to align with you, right? If you can use that to convince people.
Mm,
And but the thing is, objective principles have become unconvincing since the death of God in, what is it, 1886.
yeah, well, I think what I would say to that is they've become unconvincing, not necessarily because of the lack of truth content or the lack of necessity, but they've become unconvincing because people, I think it's more of the dumbfounding effect, as Haidt would describe it, because I think what's happened is people have chosen to be heathens more and more. I think that's really one of the highlighting principles of the new atheism in particular, because I don't think it's Nietzsche's atheism. Certainly wouldn't say it's someone like Camus' atheism or the atheism of even older philosophers. I think it's sort of a atheism which is there simply to indulge hedonistic tendencies and to say, well, there's really nothing above you. There's nothing judging you except other people, and what do their opinions matter? So go do
Well,
whatever with your life. And I think that's kind of the reason people have rejected it, not so much for lack of its truth content, but for lack of desire to be held to a moral standard.
okay, so a couple of things there. Firstly, I'll clarify, when I refer to Nietzsche's atheism, I'm not referring just to Nietzsche's atheism and his declaration of the death of God. I'm making a more broad statement about the increasing secularization of society, and
Right.
how
Okay.
that, yeah, and so that gives us a slightly new perspective on reality, where there's not really much room for God and transcendence, and that's why these arguments aren't very convincing in our modern age. But the other thing you said was the idea that there's no one above you except other people, and what do their opinions matter? But the thing is, their opinions do matter, because we have a groupish nature to us, as it's as part of our human nature, is to want to be in a community with others, and to be accepted by others, and to be validated by others. This is something that even John Stuart Mill wrote about as being one of the basis for his moral theories, like it or dislike it as you like. But the thing is, we have a desire to fit in with other people. In fact, that's one of the premises of the irrationalism, not irrationalism, like the intuitionism of someone like Jonathan Haidt, and some of the more evolutionary theories of morality, is that we care more about social inclusion than we care about truth.
Mm.
That's just part of human nature. And so, even if we accept that there's no God and that there's no one watching us from above, um, the opinions of other people still matter, and that's where morality comes from.
I think,
That's why it functions. Sorry, I clarified that. That's why it works, or has some
yeah,
appearance of working in some contexts, right? It's why it works as well as it does. Is because we have this desire um to be connected with our neighbors, so to speak.
I certainly think that's it's the case in a lot of areas. The only problem is it only takes one or even a handful of individuals to sort of break that down. In that, of the psychological attitudes that humans can display, you can decide to be the egoist, and it only starts. And there's a trend. one of the other psychological trends that I think is somewhat ignored in a lot of discussions is the trend where, as much as we like being told to do and we like having authority over us because we're better rule takers and we're just more suited to take orders so that we don't have to think for ourselves, we also don't like it at the same time. It's a very dualistic relationship where we want to be told so we don't have the responsibility of bearing the consequences of our own choices, but at the same time we resent it and we kind of want to be free but not really. And so it only takes the overriding feeling of that idea that we don't really need to we don't really want to be told by other people, especially if they're just other people. Like, it was one thing when people sort of rebelled against God and it was an open rebellion against God. They kind of acknowledged the fact that it was sort of not necessarily feudal, but that there was something more to the quarrel than just like just screw you, dad. It was something much more meaningful. Whereas now, if you say there is no God and you're just screwing off the opinions of other people, you can always go to a group. You can always find a group that's more accepting of your view, even if they don't necessarily hold it themselves. And because there's this sort of flexibility in social attitudes and what we feel, there can be multiple competing moralities at once, and it sort of becomes a marketplace of moralities. And so you don't necessarily have the same care for opinions and things like that as certain people would like you to believe. Because as much as we're communal beings, there are multiple communities in which we can exist, and that's sort of a cause of a lot of conflict, both morally and in the real world itself. So I don't think necessarily that the opinions of others, as much as we do value them, are enough on their own to make morality as functioning and as binding as we would like.
That's possibly true.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that requires much more physical research, and I think it's probably something for which we're kind of just going to have to agree to disagree on, because it's
Well,
it's
no, no,
something.
no. I can really see the point that you're making there. I think that, but you are right that it's going to take a lot more to unpack, because there are a lot of factors that go into this. Like, so let's say, if everyone has a bunch of different moral dispositions, then are more likely to find community with one group over another, right? And people are sort of finding their way around, trying to find a community that they fit into, and then once that's sorted out. And if you consider that to be a problem, then you have to ask, well, what did we have before? Did we have an overarching community that was bound together by religion? But was that just an artificial binding that overrode the more natural impulses of people to fit in with particular ethics? Is it therefore constructive to try to not force necessarily, but to compel people to act against their own moral intuitions? If we can feasibly, theoretically, have everyone fit into a particular society, a small scale society that fits with their own moral impulses, is that perhaps not better than forcing them into this larger nexus of different societies and try to get them to intermingle? So there are, I think what you just said is a good point. It raises a lot of questions that will need to be unpacked, and it's all theoretical, it's all hypothetical. Like, I'm not stating anything one way or the other, but I think there are a lot of implications that could be unpacked in that particular example. So and there's a sense in which it's always true that any kind of moral system has to constrain the actions of individuals. Like, as much as I'd call myself a liberal, liberalism isn't for full liberty. Some constraints need to be made in order to have people fit into a larger society, right? So,
Right, of course.
It's not an absolutist philosophy in that sense. So, yeah, there are a lot of interesting questions raised there. I have to think about that.
Definitely, and I think that's a good place to leave it off. What about you?
Yeah, I was going to ask if there's anything else you wanted to discuss before we wrap it up, because it's hitting on midday here, and I've got a lot of other work to get through. So
Yeah, no. So I'm good. Anything else you wanted to add, real quick?
no, nothing in particular. I think it was a really good chat.
Indeed, indeed. Hopefully, we can find the time again to talk about something possibly even bigger and broader, such as we can get into that discussion about God finally.
Well, I want to do more reading up on like, because I've read a little bit of it, but more reading up on the metaphysical arguments for and against God, and maybe wade into that discussion. But I'm more focused on, like, I'm going to start looking at atheism in a couple of videos, I think, and anti-theism. Start throwing my hat into that ring, but once I get the time,
Oh
I'm a
boy.
bit short on time at this point.
All right, cool. Well, thank you again for joining me, and thanks to the audience for being here and listening. And catch you all next time. Have a good one.